Well, our next speaker is someone known to all of us, Alan Matchett, our host for this meeting, and a curator of the Dunedin Botanic Garden, over 33 years holding progressive responsibilities and transforming that garden to the beautiful place we see today. I've been sort of quizzing your staff, Alan, a little bit for something about you, but I heard something quite nice from a staff member today who suggested that Alan is a quiet inspiration to all of the staff, and I thought that was a lovely characterization. And I think that holds true with bringing this conference here to Dunedin as well. Alan was the visionary that thought that this would be a good venue for this, to celebrate the sesquicentennial of his garden, and has worked doggedly over several years. So I think the rest of the conference will be one of our expressing our appreciation to you, Alan, but let's do it now as well. Please welcome Alan.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Scott. I was worried about what he was going to say, because he did promise me he was going to ask lots of questions, because I wouldn't tell him anything. This is a photograph from the internet, and certainly from publications that everyone will be well familiar with. In 1642, Abel Tasman was credited as the first European to discover New Zealand. At this time, Pisa and Padua University Botanic Gardens were already 97 years old, having been established in 1545, generally credited as the first botanic gardens, although monastery and herbal gardens existed before that time. It was another 76 years in 1621 in England that the University of Oxford Botanic Garden was established, and another 138 years in 1759, the development of Kew. With the expansion of the British Empire and the need for economic advantage and knowledge, new botanic gardens were established in the colonies across the globe, including the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney, in 1816. Being the last significant landmass to be colonised, the development of New Zealand botanic gardens and reserves could not begin until settlements had been established and their management and financial structures set up. Dunedin Botanic Garden was publicly recognised on 30th of June 1863, followed by Christchurch Botanic Gardens only 9 days later. Auckland Botanic Garden is the baby of the group, opening in February 1982. However, these gardens were not the first public reserves to be established in New Zealand. This honour belonged to Auckland Park, or Auckland Domain. When Governor Captain William Hobson took up residence in Auckland in 1841, he set aside 100 acres for a guest house and a park. A government gardener was employed in the same year, and a nursery was established to grow European trees that were given away as plants, seeds and cuttings to anyone wishing to take them away and plant them. Another 96 acres were added, and the 196 acre site was then designated as a government domain, also referred to as Auckland Park. Remarkably, from this date, it was another 20 years before any significant development of New Zealand Botanic Gardens took place. I'm just going to jump back a fraction, just to give you a little bit of an overview about Botanic Gardens, and look at New Zealand gardens just prior to 1900. Author Winsome Shepherd graphically shows us in her research and contribution in her book, The Botanic Garden Wellington, A New Zealand History, 1840 to 1987, a collaborative text by Winsome and Walter Cook, and this was published in 1988. She tabulated information provided to James Hector, the then director of the Colonial Botanic Garden Wellington, from different authorities around New Zealand in response to a request from Kew in 1889 seeking information on the state of the domain gardens around the world. There's some interesting stats there. You can see Dunedin sitting on the top of the list. Established in 1860, it says there. However, a lot of those other dates, there's no record of any public acknowledgement of the gardens being developed in those times. But it's interesting that the amount of work that was being undertaken in New Zealand at that time. While there are obviously gaps in this work by James Hector and the tabulation by Winsome Shepherd in the book, it provides an interesting snapshot of that development, and there's 26 public gardens surveyed at that time, although they weren't all shown there. Today, the diversity of New Zealand botanic gardens and parks is well documented in Paul Trittenbach's book, Botanic Gardens and Parks in New Zealand, an illustrated record shown here. This was published in 1987 and contains a comprehensive historical record of 19 botanic gardens, domains, gardens and parks. While this publication does not identify all the public gardens in New Zealand, he had indicated he had plans to produce a following publication. Now let's have a look at some of the other gardens. Napier Botanical Gardens, where 18 acres were set aside for a botanical garden in 1854. This was never developed beyond appearing as an allocation of space on a very early map of an unnamed town, which was later called Napier. However, by 1874, at which time Napier was then declared a borough, the provincial government had already established botanical gardens. Timaru Botanic Gardens. This was established in 1864 with 25 hectares of land set aside for a public park. Typically little happened in the early years, but gradually progress was made, and today Timaru's Botanic Gardens features a conservatory, notable collection of roses and native tree ferns. A nationally significant event and first for New Zealand occurred at Timaru Botanic Gardens, when seed in 1948, gathered in China from the Dawn Redwood, Metasequoia glyptostreboides, was sourced from Arnold Arboretum and germinated, grown on and then distributed as New Zealand's first introduction of the species. While there have been other introductions around New Zealand, most trees would have originated from this source. Gisborne Botanical Gardens. This is Gisborne's oldest reserve, and in 1874, 2.5 hectares was set aside beside the Tarahiru River as a recreational reserve, and this was extended later to 5 hectares. The Botanical Gardens in its earlier years was being developed as a formal botanic garden with ornate grand entrance gates, wide pathways and rows of flower beds. In another phase of development during the 1960s, Council decided it was to be managed as a park. However, in the 1970s, the gardens was shifting back to a botanic garden style management. There were other attempts also to establish botanical reserves, and one of these is One Tree Hill Domain, where the Auckland Provincial Garden set aside 10 acres of Crown Reserve on the East Crater for a provincial botanical garden in 1871. They had plans to lease the remainder of the property to develop a revenue stream to maintain and develop the garden. Unfortunately, this didn't progress any further, as provincial governments throughout, or provincial councils throughout New Zealand were abolished in 1876. And of course, this development proceeded no further. There are botanic gardens in nature, but not in name. Pukekura Park is one of these. Established in 1875 during the last public act of the then Taranaki Provincial Council, when they passed the Botanical Gardens and Public Recreations Grounds Bill, this was ratified by the National Parliament a year later with the passing of the Taranaki Botanic Garden Act. That same year, 1876, 3 exotic trees and a native pururi were planted during a public ceremony in recognition of the establishment of the Taranaki Botanic Garden. In 1908, this reserve was renamed Pukekura Park, which of course remains the name today, albeit with a Brooklands estate added. Eastwood Hill, the National Arboretum of New Zealand. Plantings commenced several years after the property was purchased by Douglas Cook in 1911, and the collection continued to develop under the ownership of Bill Williams. In 1975, the Eastwood Hills Trust Act came into being. The Arboretum was designated as the National Arboretum of New Zealand for the purposes of scientific and educational purposes and for the enjoyment of people of New Zealand. Eastwood Hill is widely reported to have the largest collection of Northern Hemisphere plants in the Southern Hemisphere. Otari, I'm going to refer to here, Otari Open Air Plant Museum as it was established. This is a 5-hectare garden dedicated to the cultivation of New Zealand plants, and by its presence within the Wilton's Bush Reserve, oversight of 100 hectares of native forest, which is some of Wellington's oldest trees, including 800-year-old rimu. The plant collections were established here in 1926 by eminent New Zealand botanist Dr. Leonard Cockayne. His aim was to establish a collection of solely New Zealand native plants. Otari Native Botanic Garden and Wilton's Bush Reserve, as it is known today, is the only public botanic garden in New Zealand solely dedicated to native plants. Hamilton Gardens. The first development of these gardens began in the early 1960s at what was then the early waste disposal site. The first significant development was the Rogers Rose Garden, which opened in 1971. Today, Hamilton Garden is described as not being a traditional botanic garden with conventional plant collections, but rather its purpose has been to promote the appreciation and understanding of gardens, their history, context and meaning. And in their management plan, they've described that as the relationship between people and gardens. And what of other New Zealand public gardens and domains? In this history of New Zealand Botanic Gardens, I also wish to acknowledge the contribution that other public gardens and domains have contributed in terms of development of botanic gardens elsewhere throughout New Zealand. Queen's Park in Invercargill, the Ashburton Domain. And in some instances, these gardens have challenged our larger gardens in their wealth of plant collections and development of horticultural expertise and practices, and have frequently been the training grounds of future directors and managers and for horticultural staff of other institutions. For example, early curators at Oamaru Public Gardens, Mr. J.G. Mackenzie, 1918, was appointed Director of Botanic Gardens and Reserves in Wellington. And then in 1928, Mr. M.J. Bennett moved to take up the position of Superintendent of Parks and Reserves in Christchurch. It should never be overlooked the value of the successional opportunities provided by our smaller gardens. And what of our newer botanic gardens? At Whanganui, the Basin Botanic Gardens is an interesting addition to the network of New Zealand Botanic Gardens. In 1966, the late Stanley and Blanche Basin offered the 25-hectare farm and homestead garden as a gift to the city. Typical of the period, there were some vigorous discussions and debate in the council's debating chamber, with the concerns of affordability and an overextension of land holdings should they accept. However, they did accept this gift. Stanley Basin had a dream and was quite definite in what this gift was to be used for. It is to be a botanic garden, not a park, largely for scientific purposes, catering for both utility and aesthetic interests, a place for study, not just for pretty flowers. Auckland Botanic Garden. Discussions may have first started in the late 1920s, but there was little progress until the 1960s when a group of like-minded people formed a committee to locate suitable land for a new botanic garden. A block of land owned by the university at Tamaki was considered, but later discounted, and then in 1964, an 82-hectare block in Manuera, the Nathan Estate, was considered. In a joint purchase, the Auckland Regional Authority purchased 42 hectares, Manukau City Council the remaining 40. This land was grazed until 1970. The Auckland Authority then purchased a further 20.5 hectares of this land from Manukau City, who at the same time gifted a 2-hectare block of land to provide the garden with a northern road frontage. On February 19th, 1973, Auckland City Councillor Tom Pearce turned the first sod of ground, and 9 years later, on the 23rd of February 1982, the garden was opened by the New Zealand Governor-General, Sir David Beattie. And what of our already established gardens? In 1839, the New Zealand Company Directors advised the Surveyor-General, Lieutenant Mine Smith, that his survey of the new settlement of Wellington, that he was to make adequate provision for reserves, including cemeteries, a marketplace, and a botanic garden. In 1844, 12 acres of land beside the Karori Road, being part of the town belt, was set aside by the government for the botanical reserve. And Karori Road is the road running up to the right. The following year, this 12 acres had another acre added to it, and it was then identified in the plan and described as the Botanical Reserve. However, it wasn't until 1869 before the garden was developed. Under the stewardship of James Hector, he also managed and supervised the Colonial Museum and the New Zealand Geological Survey, and he also became the manager of the New Zealand Institute. So it's 3 separate institutions. The New Zealand Institute was given authority to establish a botanic garden, but only after long-term supporter of a colonial botanic garden, Alfred Ludlam, successfully introduced the Botanic Garden Bill into Parliament. In 1847, the Canterbury Association in London was formed to establish a Church of England settlement in New Zealand, and shortly after, Captain Joseph Thomas was sent to New Zealand to select a site for the settlement. In 1855, the superintendent of the province and founder of Christchurch, John Godley, was given permission to set aside land to make plantations and gardens. Approximately 500 acres was selected for Hagley Park. However, insofar as development of a botanical reserve, there was little progress until 1864. Significantly, the year before, the Albert Edward Oak had been planted to commemorate the wedding of the Prince of Wales, and subsequently that became the official founding date of the Christchurch Botanic Gardens. Now, at a public meeting in 1864 to discuss the formation of the Canterbury Horticultural Society and the Acclimatisation Society, it was agreed that Hagley Park would be a good place to establish a botanic garden. After approaching the provincial government, a commission was appointed to promote the cultivation and planting of the government domain, the botanical garden, in connection with the objects of the Acclimatisation Society. Dunedin. The original public reserve was identified in 1848 in a survey of 9 acres, and through it ran the quiet waters of the Leaf. The site was increased to 11 acres, and by November 1864, the entire garden had been developed and laid out in formal beds, closest to what you see it there on the photograph. However, in 1868, the garden was decimated when that little quiet stream that couldn't be improved upon flooded and washed away the greater part of the garden, including one of the royal oaks planted to commemorate the Prince and Princess of Wales' marriage in 1863. The provincial government, who had only just been established, the provincial government only just regained control of the Botanic Garden from the Dunedin City Council, who could no longer afford to run it. They began to look for a new site. And a site to the north of the current garden on the screen, which is the present site of the garden you were in on Sunday afternoon, was selected. Part of that had already been established by the Acclimatisation Society. However, this land was soon designated for its purpose as a botanic garden. Development started in earnest in 1869, with many of the surviving trees, including the remaining royal oak, were relocated to the new site. Photograph of the waters of the Leaf flooded us out. There's a photograph of the northern side of the garden. Oh, what happened there? That's where we were for the function on Sunday night. And the main George Street runs through here. So this is looking down the hill to the lower garden. And a view slightly to the south of the nursery area established in the garden at that time. And a few years later, in 1890. Back a bit. Let's have a closer look at New Zealand's gardens. Provincial governments throughout New Zealand were abolished on the 1st of November 1876. And this had a profound effect on New Zealand's developing gardens. The immediate effect was the loss of funding, relatively secure at that time. Control of the botanical gardens and reserves administered by these provincial councils was then divested to boards of control, particularly in the case of Christchurch and Dunedin. Income for maintenance and development was to come from government subsidies and endowment properties, and rentals from reserved lands. However, these were soon to prove unsustainable and inadequate. Early on, the financial pressure on the Dunedin Botanic Garden Domain Board was to prove too much, and in 1884, negotiations with the government and the City Council led to the resignation of the board and the appointment of the Dunedin City Council as the Botanical Garden Domain Board. Other gardens were also suffering from the financial hardships of the 1880s, and all were to receive another setback when the government ended all annual grants to botanic gardens in 1885. Such changes didn't affect Wellington, as it was already under the management of a board of control, having had no previous links to provincial councils. Elsewhere, botanical gardens, and elsewhere in Taranaki, for instance, the Botanical Gardens and Public Recreations Grounds Bill, the last act of the Taranaki Provincial Council, was passed, so they already had a board of control established. The Christchurch Domain Board weathered the financial hardships, continuing to manage the Botanic Gardens right through to 1946. At that stage, it was dissolved and the Botanic Gardens was placed under the control of the Christchurch City Council. Today, our Botanic Gardens are supported and managed by local and regional authorities and funded by local body rates. However, despite this supposed security, there's always been an air of vulnerability, both politically and financially, and this is unlikely to change any time in the future. Many of our current day projects up and down the country have only been possible with outside help. Gardens management has actively sought to develop and strengthen alignments with community groups, businesses and individuals, and they have pursued the formation of friends groups to give gardens another voice and a vehicle of support. Those with strong, focused memberships have been providing invaluable support over many years. Evidence of this is provided at Auckland Botanic Garden with the establishment of the significant library, funded with friend support, the Potter's Children's Garden, made possible by generous funding from the Frederick Potter Trust. In Dunedin, there's the Information Centre, funded by the Friends, and a bequest provided for the development of this garden, the Clive Lister Garden. Acclimatisation societies, organisations responsible for managing the liberation of animals and also plants for sporting and economic value, played a parallel role in the early introductions of and establishments of plants and, unfortunately, animals. New introductions from around the world were being evaluated for their recreational and economic value to settlers. Many societies shared or leased land in public domains owned by the Botanic Gardens and also provided an income, which I've mentioned earlier. In Christchurch, it is recorded that the first trees planted in the domain were groups of pines, particularly radiata and pinaster, and in Dunedin, the Acclimatisation Society had already been developing the site with some of the photographs we've seen before the garden was relocated. An interesting observation printed in the Otago Daily Telegraph in 1864 around a discussion on the establishment of the local acclimatisation society in Dunedin quoted a letter from the National Review that said, "Botanists are of the opinion that in several countries many native plants have been destroyed by the introduction of foreign species." The letter writer predicting a similar fate for New Zealand's fauna. Nothing could have been closer to the truth. Another important development and opportunity for the development of New Zealand Botanic Gardens was the use of prison labour. Prisoners were a valuable source of labour used extensively by some gardens throughout New Zealand, and for the price of a warder's wage, a great deal was achieved that would not necessarily have been achieved otherwise. In Dunedin, prisoners were engaged from the very early days of the establishment of the garden, and even from 1863, and this continued to be a significant part of the workforce for a further 15 years. The workforce included a contingent of Maori prisoners who were sent to Dunedin as a result of unrest in Taranaki. While they carried out a huge volume of work, reshaping the stream beds to prevent flooding, and forming tracks and cutting out stumps, all this done during the establishment of the new garden. In Christchurch, prisoners were used in the domain, and in 1882 they broke in the land to establish a nursery for the growing of economic plants. In Timaru, this ready-made labour force was utilised in the plantings of large tracts of pines on its reserves. And what of New Zealand's National Botanic Garden? James Hector, later knighted Sir James, became one of the most influential figures in the development of the colonial Botanic Garden, Wellington. In 1865, when the government established the New Zealand Institute and placed Hector in charge, as mentioned, he was already the supervisor of both the Colonial Museum and the New Zealand Geographical Survey. In 1867, the New Zealand Institute was given the authority to establish and manage a botanic garden. James Hector was in an unusual position of directing and supervising the development of all four institutions. If there was ever a time or an opportunity for the establishment of a New Zealand Botanic Garden as a fully functional scientific and economic resource like those of overseas models of the time, this was possibly it. However, the existing Colonial Museum already had its own library and herbaria, and with no apparent moves to redistribute or rationalise any of the roles under his jurisdiction, any thoughts of a National Botanic Garden of New Zealand were laid to rest. I should say weren't laid to rest, but were certainly put on hold at that stage. At Dunedin Botanic Garden, the appointment of our new director at the time, David Tannock, in 1903, was a strong advocate for the development of a National Botanic Garden. He suggested, "It does appear desirable that there should be one botanic garden in New Zealand, and Dunedin seemed to be the most suitable place to establish it." And he may have been right. The gardens are near the university, the soil and situation so varied that a large collection of plants could be grown with a minimum of expense and effort. We should also be getting together as complete a collection of native plants as possible. And in another report to Council in 1931, he confidently claimed it is now the most complete in the Dominion. However, the idea of Dunedin as a base for a National Botanic Garden didn't receive much favour when the Dominion President of the New Zealand Institute of Horticulture, Dr. Leonard Cockayne, suggested in the first bulletin of the Institute that due to the wide range of climatic conditions, there was some doubt as to the desirability of such an institution, and went on to define a botanic garden as an open-air museum. An open-air museum of living plants, so arranged that they can be conveniently studied, with each plant clearly but not obtrusively labelled with its accurate scientific and popular name and the region for its origin. Coincidentally, Cockayne had already established the Atari Open Air Plant Museum at that time, and supported by Mr. W.R.B. Oliver, the director of the Dominion Museum, he joined the debate and supported Wellington as the best location and that Otari Open-End Plant Museum is the best institution for such a role. So a little bit of competition. And I should say, yeah, despite the best efforts of David Tannock and the onset of the 1929 Depression, any idea of the National Botanic Garden has certainly progressed no further. And I'll just finish off. Well, I won't finish off. Might have skip ahead. At that time, with the Depression, there were many frustrations around the garden, around New Zealand, I should say. And in a report from the Napier Botanic Garden, he suggests in there, provision had been made for the botanical reserves in Wellington, Napier, Christchurch and Dunedin only. And they were botanical in name only, and I regret that this still applies to the Napier Gardens. Its steep slopes of little use for other purposes, and its horticultural interests forgotten and neglected. And that really been the state of the nation for those time. Since then, of course, there's been a huge amount of development across the country, with the Dunedin Botanic Garden now reaching its 150th year. I'm just going to quickly skip through these because time is up. This is the area in the lower garden with the tea kiosk, and the information centre is now, and the site of the marquee was that large tunnel barn shaped fernery. An overhead of the garden today, the most significant feature there is in the background is the large quarry, and that is actually below the sea level. In the entranceway project at the front of the garden, a collaboration with different groups in 1996 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Dunedin City. The new Mediterranean garden, which some of you may have already seen. In Christchurch, currently they're developing a new information centre and plant nursery. Recently, in 2006, Dunedin Botanic Garden launched the development plan, a 5 to 20 year vision statement for the development of the garden, and one of these was to realign a roadway, and this is an image of the realigned road, taking traffic out of the garden to improve safety and access for one and all. And currently, some of you may have seen a bit of a bombshell at the upper garden. This is our latest proposal, and it's underway at long last, and it's been a 6-7 year battle to get this one underway. So the contract was just let before the Congress started, a building demolished, and this is a new plant propagation and nursery facility. And I'll just finish on this, and this is, as you can see there, a quote from Mr. John Tate in 1941 in his report. Now, he may have borrowed this from somewhere else, some of you may recognise it, but I think it's quite a nice way to finish, and certainly a nice way that we should move into the future. Thank you.
Terrific, Alan. I think we all have to extend our visit, those of us who have traveled to the meeting from afar, by a month to go to see all of these places. So thank you for that overview. And thank you, Brett, also for your wonderful presentation. I know that everyone will be thinking about Mount Toma in the coming days, and I hope you'll keep us informed as things go. I think that concludes us. We have some wonderful gifts for both of our speakers. Let's, again, just give them a big round of applause.